Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for attending this webinar. Today we're going to start by looking at some scenarios in which data management is a critical activity. There's a lot of daily activities that happen in your environment that require some sort of data management to make sure that your database and your file system aren't getting out of control. Then we'll look at some solutions for handling those situations. And today we're going to focus on some new BMC tools that we provide to help you do some data management. And we'll do a feature breakdown with some examples to show you so that you can get started with these tools. And then we'll provide some references at the end so you can come back and do some research on your own. As I'm sure you're aware, the data in your ITSM environment is continually growing. As users create and update incidents, as they add changes, and as users or automated processes add assets to your system, it's just causing your database and the entire environment to grow and grow. Also, you have some data like server statistics, maybe some work log data, knowledge articles that are very valuable at some point in time, but as time goes by, that data may become less and less valuable. For example, knowledge articles that were created on some versions that you don't even support anymore may not have much value or any value. And server statistics are things that usually have something to do with current events. And as time goes by, they become less and less useful. The database also stores temporary data, which is data that may have been used for one specific point in time, like an email message. Send the message out. Once it's out, probably that email message doesn't have much value anymore. Now, in some cases, it does. So if you're doing email-based approvals, those emails need to stay in the message form for a little while. But the example is if you have tons and tons of messages going out, notifications to maybe thousands of users, all those messages that are sitting in the messages form may not have any value after the message has been received. Also, you have other forms like the email error messages form, which only records error messages while sending emails. Once you've solved a problem, or maybe just at some point in time, they become less and less valuable. Other examples are like the UDM logs, NTE notifier, CII events. They're really useful at a very specific point in time, and as time goes by, they're just taking up space. And so adding all these different kinds of data, the transactional, historical, and temporary data, causes database bloat. Now, you may not call it bloat. That has a negative connotation because this is just normal usage of the database. But the idea is that there probably is data in your database that isn't needed, and that's why we use kind of the negative term bloat. Your database contains large quantities of data that aren't needed by most users most of the time, unless you are doing some sort of data management. And attachments are also something that you want to consider because attachments, depending on the size, obviously, can consume a lot of space in your database. And you may have a situation where you have attachments that are attached to tickets that are closed and work logs that are closed, long gone, maybe attachments related to knowledge articles, and those knowledge articles are related to versions that you no longer support. And so, granted, there may be many, many attachments that are absolutely useful, but the idea here is just to take note of the fact that you may have old records with attachments that really aren't needed. And some older data will simply never be accessed. And so all these things just maybe give you the idea that wouldn't it be nice to know what that data was and be able to manage it somehow? Also, the data in your ITSM environment becomes outdated and may no longer meet your retention policies. Retention policies are important to think about because there may be some legal reason why you can't store that data. Some data may need to be offlined. In our environment, using archiving, that data may just need to be moved from the live form to an archive form. And in some cases, the data actually needs to be destroyed or deleted from the system. For example, BMC recommends a policy of 2 years of production data in the live forms. And then we recommend that you archive them and store it in the archive forms for another 5 years. And after those 5 years, a total of 7 years, that data is no longer useful and should be removed. So you do need to consult your own company's retention policy and make sure that anything I talk about today meets your legal obligations with those policies. Now also, data in the underlying data tables can become out of sync, and that can cause a different situation, which is you have unneeded data because it's out of sync data. An example of that is You have history records. You may know that many of your forms have history with them, history records, and those are stored in a separate H table. Whereas the main data, the main ticket data that end users type in, goes into a T table. That's the data table. And if you had a situation where you had H records or history records that existed and the main record didn't exist, nothing would ever touch those records. They'd be completely orphaned and just taking up space. And the same thing can happen with attachment records. Attachments are stored in two different tables, a B table and a BC table. I'm not going to go into more detail about these tables, but when I show the references later on, I'll provide a link that you can go and learn about how these T, H, B, and other tables are used by the ARSystem. But you may have a situation where these records in the B, BC, or H tables exist and no main record exists. And what that means is that these records are completely orphaned and nothing will ever touch them. They're just wasting space. Now, that's not a typical scenario to happen in an ARSystem environment. If everything is going well, ARSystem will never create orphaned records. What usually happens is somebody is doing some cleanup, they're being proactive. The DBA may be getting involved and being proactive and trying to manually delete records that are very old. And they may not have known about the relationship between these other tables. In fact, that's what typically happens, is that they are manually purged and the relationship isn't maintained. And when that happens, it creates orphan data that consumes space but will never be utilized. And this actually does happen. We've had several scenarios recently. One large customer complained that they had random performance issues. And as we started looking at their database, we noticed that in their system, they had 200,000 orphan history records across 10 forms. In the entire database, 200,000 records may not seem a lot, but for the particular forms that they were running against, when the users were doing a get entry or opening up a record to look at the record, the history tables were being accessed, and the queries to the history tables were taking an inordinate amount of time. And so it did turn out that having these orphan records was causing a performance issue. We had another customer complaining of performance issues, and when we researched it, we found 480,000 orphans across 108 forms. And yes, in both of these examples, it was caused by somebody on the back end doing some cleanup and just not understanding the relationships. So that can happen, and when it does happen, that's the scenario that we want to be able to deal with. Some things to think about that may occur as a result of having a lot of extra data that you don't need is that performance may degrade because the database has to traverse more data, unneeded data. It may just take more time to find the data that you're looking for. Query result thresholds can cause undesirable search results because let's say you ask to have 500 records returned, and let's say you're storing lots and lots of extra data. Well, the first 500 that come back may not contain the data that you're looking for simply because there's so much extra data. So there is an effect on your query results. SQL indexes may become less effective. Now, this is purely dependent on the database server, but the more and more data that you have, it may be that the database server says, I have to traverse so much data anyway. It's easier for me to do a table scan than to use an index. Caching is something that happens at the database when it's loading the data pages into memory, and the more data pages, the more memory that it may be taking. And one big effect of having a lot of extra data is, let's say you're setting up a new environment and you want to make a backup of your database. Well, we've had situations where the customer says, I can't make a backup because it takes so long to do it. I can't do it during production hours. And so it's the simple act of migrating your system using a database backup or just simply backing up the database may just be so much time that it becomes impractical and it costs time and extra money to do it. So those are things to think about that happen as a result of having maybe a huge database, but more specifically having a database in which a lot of extra data is sitting in there and you don't really need to use it. Now let's focus on some solutions for managing your data. Well, the first recommendation is to archive your data, to move older data out of the live ITSM system into archive forms. This will reduce the size of your live data tables that your end users are accessing. Data is still available for retention purposes. You can use the archive forms and locate specific data, and you can create reports on the archived data. Now, there's no workflow that fires on the archive forms, and they aren't generally accessible to your end users. But remember, the purpose of having the data in the archive forms is basically to keep the data live for retention purposes, and then eventually you're going to offline that data completely or delete it. So yeah, the next step is then for the data that meets the qualification of being deleted, and then you'll take the one more step of deleting that old data that no longer needs to be stored. As part of enabling archiving and configuring the policies, it is important to take a look at the existing archive policies and make sure that they're effective for your environment. That might mean changing the type of archive from copy and delete to delete, or simply changing the number of days. But whatever it is, it's important that you not only enable archiving, but that you pay attention to the policies in the configuration. The next solution is to remove any orphan data that you have. So it's possible that you are in a situation where you do have a synchronization problem between your data tables, the T tables, and H or B or BC or any other tables. And if that's true, you do need to manage that and try to get rid of the orphans. And by doing that, your tables will become smaller and perhaps provide better performance along with the indexes. If indexes are smaller, should result in better performance. And then the entire database will be smaller. And then if the DBA does a step to reclaim some of that space, the file system will become smaller as well. So overall, you reduce some of the resources that are required and potentially and likely improve performance. So what is BMC doing to help you with data management? Well, we come up with three solutions that are relatively new. One is we've provided new archive definitions based on customer feedback. So we've worked with many customers looking at their archive policies and try to figure out what is it that they really need above and beyond what comes in the out-of-box package. And so we have created a deployment package that should help improve the out-of-box archiving. We've also created a data integrity checker tool. This is a command line utility to help identify and remove orphans. We've also added a console to the server group management console that's already in your ITSM application. We've just added another flyout tab for the Schema overview console. And this is an in-app console that runs inside of ARSystem and does several things that I'm going to show later, but a couple of them is it will help you monitor the size of your forms, not only the count of the records, but the actual space that's being used by the forms. And it will also identify and fix orphans from a graphic user interface. So let's first look at what are the new archive definitions. We've already said enabling archiving is the best practice for managing data. So what we want to do is go a step beyond that and say, don't just archive it, but what can we do to make the archiving policies even better? The current out-of-box archiving policies often require that the customer perform some customizations just because you wanted to customize and maybe be more aggressive with how much data you're removing, or just simply to meet your retention policies. So BMC provides an updated set of the archiving definitions that are available in the communities. If you simply do a search on the communities for Helix ITSM support, managing system data, you'll see a communities article that includes a couple D2P packages. So there's two D2P packages. One is for 1805 and up, which is all the way up to 2002, and then another D2P package for a container environment, which was 21.x and above. So the 1805 and up package includes modified policies for several forms that include the ones I've listed here, such as ARSystem email error logs, NTE notifier, your server statistics. Now, server statistics is a good example of a form that didn't prior have any archiving policies, but most of the data in the server statistics form is unused after a certain amount of time. And so this is a really good one just to add to the list to help keep your data clean. In 2002 and above, because this is now the converged server that includes ARSystem with ITSM, it also includes the Innovation Studio components and DWP. And with DWP in there, there's an extra workflow that when you use DWP, it will create records in your ITSM suite. And there are activity forms that once the work log or the information gets created in ITSM, the activities are no longer needed. And so we've created several, this is just a small sample here, but we've created several archiving policies that have to do with these activities information that's no longer needed. Along with adding archiving policies, we've also added a couple associations. And what the associations do is make it so that if you delete a record from a form, if there's any children records that are no longer of any value once the parent record is gone, then the children records will also be deleted. And so this just helps maintain continuity and cleaning up extraneous data that would no longer be used. And so we've created a couple other associations that will really help make sure that you're cleaning up data that's not needed. Now, some of the policies that are provided in these packages already exist, but what we've done is change the number of days or the qualification, and maybe even the archive type, such as going from copy and delete to just delete. And so those have been changed in these new policies, and that's all been based on what we've seen our customers need over and over again. So this isn't just one or two customers that thought deleting was a better idea than copy and delete. This is something that's been generally accepted amongst many of our customers. So BMC recommends that you configure archiving to begin with. That's the first step. And do it to enforce your retention policies and manage your space, and then get these new archive definitions to even go one step beyond. The next thing I want to look at is the Data Integrity Checker tool. This is a command line utility that can be run directly to ARServer, but you can also go directly to the database. So you can bypass ARServer. Kind of depends on what permissions you have. If your DBA is involved, you may want to go directly to the database. And this utility will check for all kinds of schema orphans. So it'll look at the T, H, B, BC, and S tables. Now, I haven't really gone into detail about what these are. I did mention that the T is your main data table, H is history. B table is for attachments, and it stores the attachment file name and the original size and the compressed size. And then the BC table actually has the raw data with the attachment in it. And there's another table, which is the S table, which is optional. It's used whenever you use the subquery option for row level security. So if you've enabled subquery on a form, and if you don't know what that means, that's maybe for another time, but you could potentially have an S table as well. And this utility will look for orphans in any direction of any relationship amongst these tables and make sure that any children records have a corresponding parent record. And if they don't, it will let you know and give you the opportunity to fix that. So you can just run this utility and look, and you can see if there's any problems. And if there's only a couple problems, you can pass the log to your DBA and say, hey, can you fix these couple small things? You can analyze and fix a single form, multiple forms by providing a list of forms, or just have it do all the forms. So you can decide how much you want to do all at once. You can go ahead and run the analysis, find out how big of a problem you have, and then start small. Maybe just fix a single form at first, and then decide whether you want to give it a list of forms or just go ahead and do all of them. To get the utility, just go to the BMC communities and search for Helix ITSM support Data Integrity Checker tool, and you'll find it. Once you find the article, there's a file that you can download, a zip file, and it will contain multiple files, but the most important file is the java.jar file. And to execute it, you do like you do most Java programs. You run java-jar and then the name of the jar file, data integrity checker.jar, and then you pass it some options. So this next page lists most of the options. There's actually quite a few options. Depending on your database and your environment, there's some more options. Well, let's go through. These are the most commonly used and the required options. So you have to specify the type. Now you can connect directly to ARServer, and if you do that, some of the options below will be the connection information for ARServer. You also can go directly to your database, whether it be Oracle, SQL Server, or Postgres. And again, depending on which one of these, you'll have different options below. There's 3 different modes. You can analyze only, or you can execute only, or you can do both in one shot. So the execute requires an input file if you do it separately. So luckily, when you run analyze, it creates an output file that you can look at, make sure it's what you want to do, and then use that output as input to the execute mode. And if you do it all at once, it will analyze, it'll find the issues, and it will go ahead and fix all the issues that it found. So a few other options you might need to look at is the -X for the server name, -T for the port, -U. It's going to be username, and if you're connecting to ARServer, this will be the ARSystem user. Otherwise, if you go to a database, it'll be the database user. The -FL is a form list. So if you want to work on one or just a few forms, you can provide it a pipe separated list of forms. Now the -EF is if you're in execute mode, then you need to pass an input file, and the input file is going to be a JSON formatted file, and luckily, if you're on the analyze mode, it generates a JSON formatted file that you can use here. -URL is an option when you're connecting directly to the database. You can provide a JDBC valid URL, and then if you provide the URL, you can skip some of the other connection parameters here. So if you don't provide the URL and you're connecting to Oracle, you'll need to provide the SID or the service name. But if you provide the URL, then that will all be contained in there. The rest of the parameters are mostly connection parameters for the different databases. Let me show you some examples. Let's say I'm running against a local ARSystem server and I want to use analyze and execute mode with the username demo, and I only want to look at the user in the HBD help desk forums. So I'd run my java-jar, provide the jar file name, and my type is going to be ARS because I'm connected to AR server. I'm going to use the mode analyze execute since I want to do both at once, and then I provide the host name and the login name. In this case, there's no -P, so I'm assuming the password is blank, and then I give it a form list, and there's just the two forms I listed with a pipe separating them. I'll run that, and it'll go ahead, it'll identify the orphans, and it will fix them. Next example is, let's say I want to run directly against a SQL Server database, not against the ARSystem, and I only want to use analyze mode, and my username is ARadmin, and I'm using the ARSystem database. So again, I provide the Java command with a .jar file, and the type this time will be MSSQL. The mode is analyze, and then I provide my connection information. And in this case, there's a couple options I hadn't mentioned earlier, but depending on your database and what parameters are required, I can tell that I want to connect in secure mode and use a trusted login name. So that's how I would do that option. The last example is if I want to connect to an Oracle database, not ARSystem, and I want to use analyze only mode, and then I want to provide the service name. So again, I provide the Java command with type Oracle, the mode is analyze, and then I provide the appropriate database connection parameters there. Just some considerations you might want to be aware of ahead of time is this can be a heavy and intensive operation because it is querying lots of tables, it's doing lots of queries. So it's recommended that you don't run this during peak usage hours. Now the resource utilization is going to be different depending on if you're connecting to ARSystem or directly to the database. If you're going through ARSystem, then you're going to be tying up ARSystem threads, and this uses fast and list threads, does not use a private RPC socket. So you might be tying up user-facing connections, and so it's recommended you don't run this on a user-facing server if possible. Now, if you're running connect directly to a database, then you won't have that issue. This utility deletes records. It deletes records that are found to be orphans. Those records can't be undeleted, so make sure when you run this utility and when you perform the execute or the analyze execute all at once that you have a backup before you do that. Now again, the utility can run against ARSystem or the database. So when it runs against ARSystem, it's using remedy AR API calls. When it goes directly to the database, it's using JDBC to connect. Once you perform an operation that does a bunch of deletes, you don't necessarily get your disk space back. So the DBA is likely going to need to run some kind of reclaim or a coalesce or in Postgres a vacuum command. But whatever the appropriate command is to reclaim that file system space, your DBA is going to have to do. It will remove the data from the tables. It just won't necessarily reclaim the space on the disk. Let's look at some tests that we've done. We did a test that took 30 minutes and processed 1.5 million orphan records in one of our test systems. And those orphan records are spread across 5 heavily used forms and found orphans in the H, B, and S tables. It took 30 minutes. So that's maybe what you could expect in your environment. BC tables, which have the actual raw data for the attachments, will take longer because they usually have a lot more disk space. So just be aware that if you find when you do the analyze that a lot of your issues with BC tables, may expect the cleanup process to take a little bit longer. This is what the screen looks like when you run it from a Windows box. You see, when I run it, it tells me what parameters it used, and then it tells me it's processing the different forms involved. And then in this case, it found 2 orphans. And so you see it shows me the form name, the actual table name, in this case H1708, has an orphan, and it also shows me the exact command that it would use to fix that problem. So that's why you may not want to use the execute mode up front, is because you can just look at the commands here and issue them yourselves, and you may feel safer if you're executing them rather than letting a script execute them. So you have that option. The nice thing is that the output does give you the exact command that you would need. When you're done running this utility, you'll end up with 3 new files: an HTML file, and that is your log output, and I'll show you that in a second. And then you'll have your JSON file, which is used as input if you're going to run the execute, and then you have a log. So let's look at the HTML file. It's a really nice formatted file. In my case, again, I found 2 orphans. It's very clear from the output here what it found, what tables it found them in, and then how to fix them. So very nice, useful output. The JSON file just looks like this. It's maybe as you expect. It's just a JSON formatted file that gives you the form that it found it in, the table that the problem was in, and the command that needs to be used to fix it. So you can see that if you were going to say, look at the JSON file, do some modifications, maybe you don't feel safe about certain forms or tables that you want to touch, so you can remove those from the JSON file before you run the execute step. The last data management tool that I want to show you is the ARSystem Schema Overview Console. This is an in-app console, which is an extension to the existing ARSystem Server Group console. Nice thing is, this is already on the menu that you're already used to using, so it's available all the time to anyone that's an administrator in the system. And it will do several things. One thing it will do is it'll check for schema orphans, just like the utility I just showed you. This will do it from a GUI instead of a command line. It'll provide live results, so you can look at it, analyze, and then you can even take action on it from this form. So it can analyze and remediate a single form, multiple forms, or all forms, just like the utility did. But another thing that the console does is it gives you information about space utilization. So it'll give you sizing for your forms based on the number of records and the actual space used in the database. There's 3 consoles that are subpages of the Schema Overview console that provide you a little bit more detailed information. One is a form info, one's form size information, and one's orphan data information. When you go to the communities, you can search for Helix ITSM support, ARSystem Schema Overview Console, and you'll find an article that has 2 packages in it. And you'll download one or the other depending on which version you're using, either 2002 or 2105 and above. And when you deploy that package, you'll see this new Schema Overview Console as part of the Remedy Management Console or the ARSystem Management Console. When you open up the console, you'll see something that looks like this. And I just want to quickly look at this, and I'll show you more details later. But this is what the main screen looks like. It lists all the forms, their schema IDs, and then some other related information. In this case, it shows you the total count for the T table, the total size of the schema, and the total number of orphans right here. Now, in the fly-up menu, I have 4 different options. I can choose the main Schema Overview console, which has a table that looks like the first example here, shows the schema ID, table count, size, and orphans. If I choose the next console, it's called the Schema Row Detail console. And this has slightly different information because it also shows the count in the T tables as well as the count of the H table and the S table and the B table. So this is a nice table to look at the number of records that you have in all the different tables for your forms. The next console is the Schema Size Detail console, and this gives another view for kind of the same information as the last console, but based on the actual disk space size that's used in the database for these tables. So you'll see for the second entry here, time entry form is schema ID 4032, and I can see the T table size is about 10 megabytes on the disk. It doesn't have an H table, so there's no H table size. And it does have row level security set to subquery, so it has about 1.2 megabytes in the S table size. And it doesn't look like there's any attachments because the B table has 0. And then I get the total space used in the disk for the database is about 11 megabytes. So it's really nice information, and you can sort this by the different sizes or by the form name, however you'd like, but it gives you a tool that you can use to analyze your space usage. And then the last console is the Schema Orphan detail console. This gives you more granular information about any orphans that you might have in your system. So these are the 4 consoles that are provided with this package. At the bottom of the consoles, underneath them, is all the control buttons. So these buttons allow you to reload the statistics, to clean up your orphans, either based on a form or all the forms, and then maintain your database by doing a shrink or even collect new statistics. So that's one important thing I hadn't mentioned before, is when you delete a lot of data, and this is assuming that you are deleting a lot of data, but an example, let's say you found a lot of orphans and you went ahead and deleted the orphans. Well, now your data distribution may be different than it was the last time the statistics were collected. And so it may be a really good idea to collect statistics again. Now, the shrink database and the collection of statistics is something that you really need to talk to your DBA about before you do it. Now, clicking on these buttons will go ahead and do it, but only if you click on the DBA assistance confirmed checkbox. So you take the onus upon yourself that when you did this, you had your DBA's permission to do it. So let's look a little bit more closely at the schema size detail console. So it's important when you're doing data management to kind of know where your data is. Where is your space being used? And so this is just another view of the console I showed you earlier, but full screen here. And you can see you get a lot of detail. You can sort by the table size, and you can see which tables are consuming a lot of space, and then you can decide what you need to do about it. One thing from here is you don't know if there's any orphans. So this just tells you it's consuming a lot of space. So once you decide that a form is consuming a lot of space, you may want to go back and run the orphan tool and just see if there happen to be orphans in that table or the form, just to make sure that's not the issue. The next thing is you may go back to the row detail console, find out how many records are in that form. But one way or the other, you may make a decision that you need to do some sort of action like enabling archiving or making your archiving policies more aggressive, whatever it is. But this gives you the opportunity to find out where your data is so that you can take that action. And then I want to look at the orphan detail console a little more closely. So this is where it shows you the orphans in all the different forms and in all the different tables. And you can go ahead and use the command line utility if you'd like. It was very simple, but also from here, if you're looking at a particular form, and in this case here, the first form has an orphan in it. It's only one orphan, and I know that this is a test form, so I could go ahead and just simply delete the schema orphan for this one schema. If I had lots and lots of forms that had orphans in it, I could potentially choose to delete all the orphans. And especially if this was a test environment, I might feel perfectly safe doing that. If it wasn't a test environment, if this was production, I might try 1 or 2, talk to the DBA, make sure everything worked as planned. And then if I'd like, I can go ahead and delete all the orphans at once. Or one more option would be is I can select multiple records and then delete the orphans from just a few specific forms all at one time. So that's the last tool I wanted to talk to you about today regarding data management. And now I want to make sure that you have enough tools to go and start this process on your own. So in the back of this, I provided several references for you to look at. The first is a best FAQ on data management for ARSystem and BMC Helix ITSM. Now this is an FAQ that has a bunch of questions and answers that should help you with your own question and answers, and it links to documents and webinars and other resources that should help you set up your own data management policies on your own environments. The next reference is the Remedy ITSM Archive Best Practices. This is an article that talks about how to enable and configure the policies, and it even talks about how to set up your ARSystem environment to get the best use out of archiving. The third reference is the basic archiving documentation. It's very good documentation. This link actually points to the 2002 version, but depending on the version that you're using, you can find the related page. The documentation is very thorough, and helpful, so I would start there. The next reference is understanding relationships between forms and database tables. So when I talked about the T, H, B, and other tables, that's all documented here. And this is something that you may want to understand, but you also might want to provide to your DBA if they're going to be the ones working on the underlying tables. A year or so ago, I did another webinar for archiving, and that link is here. It's the Connect with BMC Helix ITSM Getting Started with Archiving webinar. So if you haven't started with archiving at all, I would recommend that you look at that and watch that webinar. We provide a troubleshooting guide for archiving. So if you started archiving and you've run into a problem, you definitely should look at the troubleshooting guide that we've already set up for archiving issues. Next is the Data Integrity Checker tool. If you simply search for Data Integrity Checker tool on the communities, you'll find this link here. The next link is the new ARSystem Schema Overview console, and this is the actual link that you'll find if you do a search for that. And lastly is the new archiving policies, and you'll find that in an article called Managing System Data, and here's the link here. So in summary, you should start your data management with archiving. If you haven't started archiving already, watch the webinar, get some ideas, and go ahead and enable archiving. Next would be to enhance your archiving policies with the new archive policies that we provide on the communities. The next thing is to make sure that you don't have orphan data wasting space and affecting your performance. So you can look at the Data Integrity Checker utility and analyze and even fix your orphan data issues if you have one. And lastly, take a look at the new console that we provide and use it to monitor your size of your data. It's a good idea, even if you're not going to use the utility to fix orphans, which you can do. It is a great utility just to monitor and keep an eye on the size of your different forms and your different tables. So please visit the BMC community at community.bmc.com. And if you had a question today that didn't get answered, you can feel free to ask your question to the peer support channel on the communities. Well, thank you everybody for attending today.